That night quickly became one of the most intense and unforgettable experiences of my life. It was an ordinary Saturday, the kind where everything seemed calm, but just beneath the surface, something was waiting to break. It wasn't just the fun we were having, or the fact that I was spending time with my best friend. It was something deeper. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place, but it made everything feel more intense, more alive. Chris and I had been friends for as long as I could remember. We were practically inseparable, spending almost every weekend at each other's houses, playing video games, and talking about everything from school to life. There was never anything between us, at least not on the surface. But deep down, there was always something there, something I couldn't put my finger on. It was like a spark, small and barely noticeable, but always there, waiting. We were hanging out at his place like we always did. His parents were out for the night, which meant we had the house to ourselves. The evening started out like any other. We ordered pizza, played some games, and joked around. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The jokes got quieter, the silences longer, and before I knew it, we were sitting in his living room in the dark, the TV on in the background, both of us lost in our thoughts. "I can't believe we're graduating soon," Chris said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost wistful. "Yeah," I replied, not sure what else to say. Graduation felt like a lifetime away, but it was creeping up on us faster than either of us wanted to admit. He looked over at me, his expression unreadable. "You ever think about what happens next?" I shrugged. "Not really. I guess we'll figure it out, right?" Chris didn't say anything for a moment, his gaze drifting away from me and back to the TV. The silence stretched between us, and for the first time that night, it felt heavy, like there was something unsaid hanging in the air. "You know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "things are gonna change." I frowned. "What do you mean?" After we graduate," he continued, still not looking at me. "We're not going to be around each other as much. Things won't be the same." The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't really considered it before, but he was right. After high school, everything would change. We wouldn't be able to hang out like this anymore, not every weekend, not with the same ease we always had. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I guess you're right." We fell into silence again, but this time it felt different. There was a weight to it, something that neither of us wanted to address. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken words between us growing louder with each passing second. Without thinking, I shifted closer to him on the couch. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it felt like a monumental shift. Chris glanced over at me, his eyes locking with mine for just a moment before he quickly looked away again. "You ever think about what it'd be like if things were different?" His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, his tone casual, but there was something deeper beneath the surface. "Like, if we didn't have to follow the rules, you know? If we didn't have to worry about what everyone else thinks." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was hinting at. There had always been something between us, but it had never been spoken out loud. It was just there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it felt like he was pulling it into the light. "Yeah," I said softly. "I guess I've thought about that." Chris didn't respond, but I could feel the tension between us growing stronger, like a rubber band stretched too tight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know what to do next. Everything felt like it was hanging in the balance, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite grasp. And then, without warning, he leaned over, closing the small distance between us, his shoulder brushing against mine. It was the lightest touch, barely noticeable, but it sent a shockwave through me. I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next, unsure if I should say something, do something, or just let the moment pass. But it didn't pass. Chris shifted even closer, our knees touching now, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, and I didn't know what to think. I had never considered this, but now that it was happening, I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts rushing through me. Before I could say anything, Chris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever wonder what it'd be like?" What would be like?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "To not hold back," he said, his eyes flicking toward me for just a second before darting away again. "To just do what feels right." The air between us felt thick, like I could reach out and grab it. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, but I could feel something building between us, something that had been there for a long time, just waiting for the right moment. But the story didn't end there. There was more. Chris leaned in closer, his face inches from mine now, and I could feel his breath on my skin. It was a subtle thing, just a shift in the air, but it was enough to send my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen in place, caught in the gravity of the moment, unable to move or think clearly. And then, just like that, everything shifted. The next day, everything felt different. It was as if the air around us had thickened, charged with an energy that wasn't there before. Chris and I didn't talk about what had happened that night, but we both knew something had changed. There was no going back, and that realization weighed on me as I got dressed and headed out to meet him like we always did. Except, now it wasn't like we always did. Nothing was. We had plans to meet up at the local basketball court, a spot where we'd spent countless afternoons shooting hoops and goofing off. It was our routine, something familiar in the midst of all the chaos that was senior year. But today, I wasn't sure if that familiarity would hold. After what had happened the night before, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us had shifted. When I arrived, Chris was already there, dribbling a basketball absent-mindedly. He looked up as I approached, and for a split second, I saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, like nothing had changed. Like we hadn't spent the previous night skirting the edge of something we couldn't come back from. "Hey," I replied, my throat dry. We stood there for a moment, the basketball bouncing between us, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. I wanted to say something, to break the tension that had settled between us, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt too fragile, like one wrong move could shatter whatever fragile piece we had left. "You want to play?" Chris asked, tossing the ball in my direction. I caught it, the familiar weight of it grounding me for a moment. "Sure," I said, though my heart wasn't in it. We played for a while, falling into the rhythm of the game, but the tension between us never really went away. It lingered in the spaces between our movements, in the way our eyes met and then quickly darted away, in the silence that followed every joke or comment. After a while, Chris called for a break, leaning against the chain-link fence that surrounded the court. I joined him, wiping the sweat from my brow, my mind still racing with everything that had happened the night before. "So," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "Last night," I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I had hoped we could avoid this conversation, that maybe we could pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. "Yeah," I said, not sure where to go from there. Chris was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. Did it feel weird to you?" I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What about you?" He shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "I guess. We've been friends for so long, and now..." His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but I knew what he was trying to say. "Yeah," I said again, because I didn't know what else to say. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, my mind spinning with a million different thoughts, but none of them made any sense. All I knew was that everything had changed, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Finally, Chris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can just go back to how things were?" I looked over at him, my heart sinking. "I don't know." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the ground. "Yeah, me neither." We stood there for a long time. I wanted to say something, to reassure him that everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't know if it would. I didn't know if we could go back to how things were before, and that terrified me. By the time we parted ways, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I made my way home, my mind still racing with everything that had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris, about the way things had shifted between us, about what it all meant. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control, that I was standing on the edge of something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. And then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen in the dim light. It was a text from Chris. "Are you awake?" My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen, before I finally replied. "Yeah." There was a long pause before his next message came through. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this conversation, but I knew that avoiding it wasn't going to make things any easier. After a moment, I typed out a response. "Sure. What's up?" The 3 little dots indicating he was typing appeared on the screen, and I held my breath, waiting for his response. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night." I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I typed out my reply. "Me too." Another long pause. Then, "Do you regret it?" I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but now that he had asked, I couldn't avoid the question any longer. Did I regret it? I wasn't sure. Everything was so confusing, so tangled up in emotions I didn't fully understand. After what felt like an eternity, I finally typed out a response. "I don't know. Do you?" This time, the pause was even longer. I could feel my heart racing, my hands shaking as I waited for his reply. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't expected that. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't that. My pulse quickened, my stomach churning with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Before I could respond, another message came through. I think I want to figure this out. Together." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, if he meant that he wanted to talk about what had happened, or if he meant something more. But the way my heart raced at the thought made it clear that I had my own answer. After a moment, I typed out a response. "Yeah, me too." There was a long silence after that, and for a moment I wondered if the conversation was over. But then, just as I was about to put my phone down, another message came through. "Do you want to come over tomorrow? We can talk about it in person." My heart skipped a beat. The idea of seeing him again, of talking about everything face to face, made my stomach churn with nervous energy. But at the same time, I knew that avoiding it wasn't an option. If we were going to figure this out, we needed to talk. "Yeah, I'll be there." The next day, I found myself standing outside his house, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't been this nervous to see Chris in years, but now everything felt different. The air between us had shifted, and I didn't know what to expect when I walked through that door. He opened it before I could knock, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension between us was palpable, thick in the air, and I could feel my pulse quicken. We made our way to the living room, sitting down on the couch where everything had started just a couple of days ago. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was loaded, charged with something I didn't fully understand. Chris was the first to speak, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his eyes meeting mine, "but I know that I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I had been so caught up in the confusion and fear that I hadn't stopped to think about what this might mean for us, for our friendship. But now that he had said it, I realized that I felt the same way. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The room fell into silence again, but this time it felt different. There was something hanging between us, something unspoken but undeniable. And as we sat there side by side, I realized that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The moment I stepped into Chris's room, it felt like the air had thickened, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, knowing that whatever was about to happen would change everything between us. It wasn't just about the conversation anymore. We had crossed a line, and there was no retreat. Chris closed the door behind me softly, his footsteps quiet as he moved across the room. We hadn't said much since I'd arrived, but there was no need. The way his eyes locked onto mine, the way he hovered just a few feet away, it was clear we were both thinking the same thing. It was inevitable now. He sat down on the edge of his bed, the familiar creak of the mattress breaking the silence between us. I stood there, my back against the door, my pulse racing as I tried to gather my thoughts. But it was useless. My mind was a blur, a swirl of emotions and desires I hadn't wanted to confront. Not like this. But here we were, and there was no turning back. "Do you ever wonder?" Chris's voice was soft, hesitant, but it cut through the thick air like a blade. "What if this is something we don't have to ignore?" I blinked, unsure of how to respond. My mouth felt dry, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed myself off the door and took a few steps forward. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking, and with every inch I moved closer, my heart beat faster. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth or just what I thought I should say. He smiled, but it wasn't the carefree grin I was used to. This smile was different, nervous, unsure. "I've been thinking about it a lot, more than I probably should." I swallowed, the tension between us growing with each passing second. We were standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, something that scared me as much as it excited me. But now, looking into his eyes, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling this way. I moved closer, finally sitting down next to him. We were so close now that I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, but neither of us dared to touch. Not yet. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath shallow and uncertain. But now that we were here, sitting together in the quiet of his room, there was no denying it. Chris leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the gap between us, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt like it had been years in the making. It wasn't just a kiss, it was everything. All the tension, the confusion, the fear, it melted away in that single moment of connection. It was soft at first, hesitant, like we were both unsure of what we were doing. But then, something shifted and the kiss deepened. My heart raced, my mind spinning as I let myself get lost in the moment. It was like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us, locked in this moment that I knew would change everything. Chris's hand moved to the side of my face, cupping my cheek gently as the kiss grew more urgent. I felt my body responding in ways I hadn't expected, my pulse quickening as the heat between us intensified. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing. This was happening, and there was no stopping it. Our breaths were heavy, mingling in the space between us as we finally pulled back, both of us breathless and flushed. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. I started to say something, but the words caught in my throat. What was there to say? Everything I felt, everything I wanted, it was all too much to put into words. Chris didn't say anything either. Instead, he leaned in again, his lips finding mine with a desperation that matched my own. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was all happening so fast, yet it felt like time had slowed down. Every movement, every breath felt deliberate, as if we were both hyper-aware of what was happening but powerless to stop it. There was no going back now, no pretending this wasn't real. We broke apart again, our foreheads resting against each other as we caught our breath. I could feel the heat between us, the electric charge that seemed to pulse through the air, and I knew that this moment, this night, was something I would never forget. "I've wanted this for so long," Chris whispered, his voice low and rough, sending shivers down my spine. I just didn't know how to say it. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. "Me too," I admitted, the words barely audible. "I didn't think you felt the same." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine. How could I not? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened between us. But there was no denying it anymore. This was real. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it was real. There was something so natural about it, something that felt like it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. And now that it had, there was no going back. I knew that. Chris knew that. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, locked in each other's embrace, our kisses growing more desperate, more urgent. There was no need for words now. Everything we needed to say was in the way our bodies moved together, the way our hearts raced in unison. Eventually, we pulled apart, both of us breathless and flushed, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a tidal wave. I could see the same mix of emotions in Chris's eyes that I felt in my own: fear, excitement, uncertainty. But above all, there was something else, something deeper. "I don't want this to be a mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not," Chris replied, his hand reaching out to take mine. "It's not a mistake." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this, whatever this was something more than just a moment of weakness, something more than just confusion or curiosity. But I didn't know how to make sense of it all. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of the confession. Chris squeezed my hand, his eyes never leaving mine. "Me too." We sat there in the quiet of his room, the weight of everything that had happened between us hanging in the air. There were no easy answers, no way to make sense of what had just happened. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. And that, at least, was something. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence between us comfortable now, the tension that had once been so heavy finally lifting. There was still so much left unsaid, so much we didn't understand, but at that moment it didn't matter, because we had each other, and that was enough. The room was still, but everything felt different. We sat in the quiet aftermath of something that had shifted the very foundation of our friendship. Neither of us said anything for a while, the silence stretching out in front of us. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, that held everything we hadn't been able to say before. Chris leaned back on the bed, his gaze focused on the ceiling. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, the gravity that had drawn us together still lingering in the air. It was strange how quickly things had changed between us. We had spent years side by side, but tonight had turned everything upside down. "I didn't expect this," I finally said, breaking the silence. My voice was quiet, uncertain, as I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. Chris didn't turn to look at me, but I saw a small smile pull at the corners of his mouth. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But now that it's happened, I don't know. It feels like it was supposed to." "Does this change everything?" I asked, my heart racing again. The moment of intimacy between us had shifted things, but I wasn't sure if it would stay that way, if it even could. He finally turned his head to look at me, his eyes soft but serious. "I don't think it changes everything," he said slowly, "but it changes us. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." His words hung in the air, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe he was right. Maybe the change wasn't something to fear, but something to accept, to lean into. After all, we had always been close. Maybe this was just a new chapter in our story. I lay back beside him, the cool air of the room brushing against my skin, and stared up at the ceiling with him. "So, where do we go from here?" I asked. Chris let out a small laugh, the sound lightening the atmosphere just a bit. "I guess we figure it out as we go." That was the truth, wasn't it? There was no guidebook for what we were experiencing. No clear path forward. But in a way, that was freeing. We weren't tied to any expectations or rules. We could make this whatever we wanted it to be. "I guess that's all we can do," I replied, feeling the tension in my chest begin to ease. We lay there for what felt like hours, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed easily between us, the way it always had, but there was something deeper beneath the surface now. An understanding. We didn't need to define it, but we both knew things were different, in a good way. After a while, Chris sat up, glancing at the clock on the wall. "It's late," he said, running a hand through his hair. "You want to stay over?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to stay, but because I wasn't sure what staying would mean now. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and part of me wondered if spending the night would complicate things even more. But then again, maybe complicating things wasn't such a bad thing, not anymore. "Yeah," I said, sitting up beside him. "I'll stay." Chris smiled, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, everything felt easy. We stood up, moving around the room in a comfortable rhythm as we got ready for bed, the silence between us filled with a newfound understanding. There were no awkward glances, no lingering tension, just a quiet comfort in knowing that we were in this together. As I climbed into the bed, pulling the blanket over myself, Chris lay down beside me. It wasn't the first time we'd shared a bed, but now it felt different. Not awkward, not tense, just new. Like we had stepped into a part of our friendship we hadn't known existed until now. We kept laying there in the dark, the quiet hum of the night settling around us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't some grand revelation, but it was enough. Enough to know that we weren't alone in this. Enough to know that whatever came next, we'd face it together. I closed my eyes, my mind finally quieting as sleep began to pull me under. But before I drifted off, I heard Chris's voice soft in the darkness. "Hey," he whispered. "Yeah?" I mumbled, half asleep. "I'm glad it was you," he said. His words filled me with a quiet reassurance, and I found myself smiling softly, eyes still closed. "I'm glad too," I whispered, my voice barely a breath in the darkness. As I drifted toward sleep, the future felt distant, and what mattered most was that we'd faced this moment together. That was enough for now. I never thought things would change between us, but after that night, nothing was ever the same. And while the future feels uncertain, one thing is clear. We've crossed a line we can't come back from. But maybe, just maybe, that's where we were always meant to be.